Judge mocks black teen in court, then realizes he's a genius who exposes the system. The judge thought he saw a criminal. The system thought it had another easy win. But they were dead wrong. He wasn't just another black kid in a hoodie. He was the courtroom's worst nightmare. A mind sharper than their lies, a truth they couldn't bury, and a voice they couldn't silence. He didn't just defend himself. He dismantled everything they stood on. What happens when the hunted becomes the hunter? Watch closely, because this is the day justice got exposed. Black teen shocks judge in courtroom, truth turns tables. The morning sun barely touched the cold marble steps of the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Inside, the air was still, thick with quiet tension. Not the kind that crackled with fear or panic, but the slow, suffocating weight of something that had already been decided long before the trial began. You could feel it in the way the bailiff stood, in the murmurs of the gallery, in the lazy rhythm of the judge's fingers tapping the oak desk. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, a black teenager wearing a worn-out hoodie 2 sizes too big, standing in a room that never expected him to rise. His shoulders were square, hands in his pockets, not out of defiance, but as if he was holding himself together piece by piece, breath by breath. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak, but somehow he was the loudest voice in the room. The courtroom was full that day, but not because people cared about justice. No one had shown up to hear the truth. They came for the performance. The kind of silent public execution that doesn't require a rope, just a robe and a pen. Another black boy, another stolen car, another conviction that would right itself. He was charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. A 2022 Audi A6, a fast car and a faster assumption. The prosecution painted him as a reckless youth with no respect for the law. And the judge, Walter Grayson, didn't even try to hide the disdain in his eyes. The courtroom lights reflected off his glasses as he looked down at Jalen. The smirk on his lips wasn't even subtle. "You think you're some kind of legal expert," Grayson said, voice oozing with dry amusement. "This isn't a high school debate club, kid." There were laughs, low and cruel, from the bailiff. The stenographer, even the prosecutor couldn't suppress a grin. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and the audience already knew the ending. But Jalen didn't laugh, he didn't even blink. Because he hadn't come to play a role, he'd come to rewrite the script. From the back of the room, his mother watched in silence. Denise Dawson, a paralegal for more than 20 years. She had raised him in the language of the law. Bedtime stories weren't fairy tales, they were court transcripts. Instead of superheroes, Jalen idolized defense attorneys. Instead of learning to shoot a basketball, he learned to dismantle a closing argument. Most kids his age were trying to figure out who they were. Jalen already knew who the world thought he was, a threat, a problem, a case number. But he also knew something they didn't. The system could be studied, understood, and confronted. Still, nothing could have prepared him for the way this moment felt. The room pressing in, the eyes judging, the gavel ready. Judge Grayson leaned back with a sigh. "Let's make this quick. I've got a golf game at 2. And just like that, the value of a black life was reduced to an inconvenience on someone's calendar. Jalen's lips twitched barely, not with fear, not even with anger. It was something else, something dangerous. He was ready. Because what no one knew, what no one even imagined, was that the boy in the hoodie had come wearing an invisible suit. One stitched together by every injustice his mother had whispered to him. One sharpened by every night he spent reading case law instead of scrolling his phone. He wasn't just standing in court. He was stepping into the one place the world had told him he didn't belong and daring it to look him in the eye. And for the first time in that courtroom, though they didn't know it yet. They weren't judging him, he was judging them. Black teen faces judges' disdain, truth buried beneath bias. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale authority. Above the heads of the jury, an American flag hung stiff in the still air. But in that moment, there was nothing just about the atmosphere. The room pulsed with something darker, quieter, a judgment not written in law but carved into expectation. Jalen stood alone behind the defense table, his frame slim against the massive oak furniture built to dwarf men like him. There was no suit, no silk tie to soften his presence. Just that faded hoodie, that unbent spine, that unwavering stare. Across from him, the prosecutor moved like a man already drafting his victory speech. Mitchell Carrington, white mid-40s, hair slicked back, polished shoes echoing off the floor, flipped open his case file with the same carelessness one might use to swat a fly. His confidence didn't come from the evidence. It came from the room itself. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth as glass, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this young man, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen Audi A6. A vehicle reported missing just hours before his arrest." He paused to let it sink in. The jury shifted. Even some heads in the gallery nodded. He fled through downtown Los Angeles, recklessly, dangerously. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and he matched the description provided by responding officers. He turned and finally looked at Jalen, not as a human being, but as a box on a checklist. This is not complicated. This is not confusing. This is a criminal case, and the facts speak for themselves. The thud of certainty in his voice landed like a gavel. Judge Grayson barely looked up. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming in rhythm against the armrest. His eyes flicked to Jalen like he was glancing at a price tag on something already marked down. "Go on," he muttered. Carrington took another step forward. "The defense may try to paint this as a misunderstanding, but let's be honest, Your Honor. What kind of innocent person runs from the police?" Another wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grayson leaned in, resting his chin on his hand. "Sounds straightforward to me." From the corner, the court reporter kept typing. The bailiff smirked, and for a moment it looked like the whole room was ready to skip to the sentencing. But Jalen didn't move, he didn't twitch. He just watched, because while the room was filled with people who thought they already knew the ending, Jalen had studied too many cases not to notice when the story didn't line up. His silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. At the defense table, the public defender, Lisa Thornton, rose. Her movements were hesitant, uncertain. She had said maybe 3 words since walking in. "Your Honor," she began, "my client." Jalen gently touched her arm. She looked at him confused. "I'll speak for myself," he said softly. She froze, the room did too, a beat of silence. Then the judge raised an eyebrow, visibly amused. "You'll what?" "I'll be representing myself," Jalen repeated, his voice steady and calm. The gallery stirred like someone had cracked the surface of still water. Even the prosecutor blinked, caught off guard for the first time. "This should be interesting," Carrington muttered with a dry chuckle. But something in the air had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Jalen stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the courtroom suddenly too quiet. He turned to the judge. "Before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Grayson gave a half nod, waving a hand. "Proceed." "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally witnessed me behind the wheel before the arrest. Is that correct?" Carrington didn't even look up from his file. "That's what the report states." "And that testimony," Jalen said, "was included in your evidence." "Of course." Jalen paused, then looked the judge in the eye. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony. Grayson narrowed his eyes. On what grounds? Jalen took his hands from his pockets for the first time and pointed calmly toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz wasn't on duty when the chase began, and he couldn't have witnessed anything. The silence that followed didn't feel like disbelief. It felt like disbelief starting to crack. Carrington straightened slightly, the smoothness in his face faltering. "What are you talking about?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "I'd like the court," Jalen said, "to request the officer's GPS logs from that night. If he really saw me, as his report claims, his location data should confirm that." Jalen's voice never rose. He didn't argue. He simply laid the facts out like pieces on a board. "But something tells me," he added, "it won't." The room murmured. The jury looked at each other. Judge Grayson finally leaned forward, his fingers no longer drumming. Carrington adjusted his stance. "Your Honor, we're not going to take the word of a defendant over a trained officer." Jalen didn't blink. "Then verify it. If the officer was telling the truth, the logs will show it. If not." He let the sentence hang there unfinished. But the implication was louder than any verdict. For the first time that morning, someone in the gallery stopped smirking. And for the first time in his career, Judge Grayson found himself staring down at a defendant who wasn't just standing there. He was standing his ground. The courtroom shifted just slightly, like a breeze had passed through, but no one felt it. Only the silence noticed. The kind of silence that doesn't fall, it breaks. Jalen had just told the court he would be representing himself. He said it gently, no theatrics, no pride, just a calm decision stated as fact, like saying he'd walk himself home even after being pushed off the bus. His public defender froze in place. Her eyes darted between the judge and the boy beside her, unsure of whether to protest or to protect. Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. "You're what now?" he asked, tilting his head. "I'm representing myself," Jalen repeated, voice low but firm. Grayson leaned back, amused. "Well, this should be entertaining." Carrington let out a short laugh under his breath, already flipping his file closed like he didn't need to prepare any more. But they didn't understand what they had just invited to the table. Jalen stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through rooms that were never built for him. Rooms that were designed to keep him out, to talk over him, to write his story without asking for his name. But today, he had the pen. "The prosecution claimed that Officer Ruiz personally witnessed me in the stolen vehicle," Jalen said, "and his report was submitted as key evidence." Carrington gave a sharp nod, as it should be. Jalen paused, letting the moment hang. "Then I request that the officer's GPS logs from that night be entered into review." Carrington frowned. "That's irrelevant, his report." Jalen didn't let him finish. "If his report is accurate, then the logs will support it. If he was never near the scene, then the testimony should be stricken." He turned to Judge Grayson. "That's reasonable, right? We want truth, not assumption." The room shifted again. People stopped whispering. Someone near the back crossed their arms. The jury wasn't smiling anymore, not because they were convinced, but because they realized they had underestimated the boy in the hoodie. Grayson tapped his fingers on the bench, slower now. "Does the prosecution object?" Carrington hesitated. It was just a breath, just a pause, but it was enough. Jalen caught it, so did the jury. "If you're sure of your witness," Jalen added, "you shouldn't be worried." Carrington clenched his jaw, eyes locked on Jalen. "No objection, Your Honor." But the damage had already been done. Because in that moment, Carrington looked less like a man building a case and more like someone trying to hold a crumbling one together. And Jalen, he didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted his stance and kept going. "I'd like to talk about the fingerprints next," he said. Grayson motioned for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. "You're being asked to believe that my fingerprints on a steering wheel means I stole a car." He paused. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever picked up an item at a store, turned it over, maybe even tried it on, then put it back?" He let the question settle. Hours later, someone else walks out with that same item stolen. Should you be arrested because your fingerprints were there? A woman in the jury looked down. A man on the far left leaned back in his seat. No one answered. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven. Hours before it was stolen, I walked by it with friends. The door was unlocked. I opened it, just out of curiosity. I leaned inside for a second, that was it. He let the truth rest, unpolished, simple. I didn't drive it, I didn't take it, I didn't even sit in it. The room was quiet again, but not because they didn't believe him. They just didn't know how to reconcile this version of the story with the one they'd already written in their heads. That's the thing about being black in a courtroom like this. You're guilty in the room long before they ever check the facts. Jalen knew it. But he also knew something else. They had let him speak, and now that he had the floor, he wasn't going to waste a single word. Black teen challenges forensic evidence, courtroom holds breath. The courtroom lights hummed softly above the silence, casting a pale glow over faces now frozen in attention. What once felt like a performance had turned into something raw, real, the kind of moment where truth didn't knock, it demanded to be let in. Jalen stood still in the center of it all, his hands finally out of his pockets, his voice the only sound that mattered. "They said my fingerprints were found on the steering wheel," he repeated slowly. "And that's supposed to mean everything." Grayson tilted his head, watching him now, not with ridicule, but with something closer to curiosity. Jalen turned to the jury again. "But let's talk about how that fingerprint got there. Let's talk about how that evidence was handled." Carrington shifted in his seat. A subtle adjustment, but not subtle enough. "Your Honor," Jalen continued, "was the forensic specialist who processed that fingerprint subpoenaed to testify today." Grayson blinked, caught off guard. He looked over to the prosecution table. Carrington hesitated, then answered without lifting his gaze. "No, Your Honor." Jalen nodded slowly. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but the one person who could actually speak to how it was collected, how it was stored, and whether it was contaminated, isn't here." He looked directly at the jury. "Which means I can't cross-examine, I can't ask about the chain of custody, I can't question the accuracy of the test. You're just supposed to take their word for it." He paused. "But you've seen how that works out." Carrington opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it. His eyes narrowed. His posture stiffened. Jalen took another step forward. "The truth is, fingerprints aren't a smoking gun, they're a trace. A whisper that someone was there. Not that they committed a crime, not that they stole anything, not that they ran from police." He let the words settle, then shifted tone. "We live in a world where a black fingerprint means more than a white confession. Where proximity becomes guilt, where touching something becomes a crime." No one moved, not the judge, not the jury, not even the courtroom clock. "Let me ask you this," Jalen continued. "If someone left a soda can on your front porch and the police found your fingerprints on it, would they arrest you for trespassing?" He looked at each juror one by one, because that's what's happening here. A woman near the front leaned forward, her brows furrowed. Grayson looked down at the file in front of him as if suddenly unsure how much weight it truly carried. Carrington tried to interject. "Your Honor, the state still maintains." Jalen raised his voice for the first time, just enough to cut through. No, what the state maintains is that assumptions are stronger than truth. That a boy like me, from a neighborhood like mine, wearing clothes like these, couldn't possibly be innocent. He turned to Grayson. Is that justice? Grayson didn't answer, because in that moment the room wasn't his anymore. Jalen had it now, not because he shouted, not because he fought, but because he stood. And every word he spoke peeled back the layers of a system that never expected him to speak at all. Black teen reveals hidden statement, owner's words change everything. Jalen let the silence breathe before speaking again. The courtroom now hung on every word, no longer dismissing him as just a kid. Not anymore. Your Honor, he said, voice steady, eyes locked on the bench. I'd like to enter a piece of evidence the prosecution failed to include. Carrington immediately stiffened. Objection. That statement. Let him finish, Judge Grayson interrupted, his voice low but firm. Jalen pulled a sheet of paper from the folder he had brought with him. It was slightly bent at the corners, the ink faded in spots, but the truth it carried was untouched. This is the original police report taken the night the Audi was reported stolen. In it, the registered owner, Raymond Whitaker, gave a sworn statement. He turned to the jury, then began reading. I left my car running when I went inside the gas station. Some kid jumped in and drove off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. The kid I saw was white. Gasps swept the gallery. One juror dropped her pen. A ripple of stunned silence replaced the courtroom's earlier skepticism. Jalen looked at Carrington. Did you forget to mention that part of the report, or did you just decide it didn't matter? Carrington stood frozen, lips parted but no words coming out. Jalen faced the judge again. This is not hearsay, it's not speculation, it's the registered owner describing what he saw. And he said the person who stole his car wasn't me. He turned back to the jury. So what does that mean for everything we've heard today? What does that mean for the fingerprint, the chase, the assumptions? He took a breath. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the gas station. I wasn't even alone. I had been walking with 3 friends just blocks away from where the car was later abandoned. I had snacks in my hand. I was walking home. He paused again. But I was black, and I was nearby, and that was close enough. Judge Grayson's face had changed, no longer entertained. Now unsure, the weight of the missing testimony pressed against him like a verdict of its own. Carrington scrambled. Your Honor, even if the description doesn't perfectly match, the defendant's fingerprints still place him. No, they don't, Jalen cut in, calm but sharp. They place me near a car I didn't take, at a time that doesn't line up. And even then, the one man who knew what he saw was ignored. He looked at the judge. Is that justice? Grayson didn't answer, his jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the file in front of him, suddenly heavy in his hands. Jalen stepped back. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for anyone to see me as a hero. I'm asking to be seen as a person, a human being, a kid who was arrested because he looked like the idea of a suspect and not because he matched one. The jury sat silent, still, leaning forward. Jalen glanced at his mother, seated quietly near the back, hands clasped in her lap, tears swelling in her eyes but not falling. Not yet. Because maybe, just maybe, her son was winning. Not just the case, but something bigger. He was forcing the system to look in the mirror. And for once, it didn't like what it saw. Black teen exposes officers lie, GPS request shakes court. The air had changed. Not by noise, but by weight. The jury leaned in, the judge no longer reclined. Even the bailiff had stopped shifting. The courtroom wasn't hostile anymore, it was listening. Jalen stood centered, both feet grounded, eyes scanning the room with calm precision. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to return to the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz." Grayson looked down over his glasses. "Go on." The prosecution submitted a statement that Officer Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle. Carrington interrupted. "It's in his written report." Jalen nodded slowly. "That's exactly the problem." He turned to the jury. "A report is just paper, a man's words, but we live in an age of data, time stamps, GPS." He looked back at the judge. "I request that the court subpoena Officer Ruiz's location data from the night in question. If he was where he claimed, the logs will prove it. But if he was..." Jalen didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The tension in the courtroom tightened like a string pulled taut. Grayson turned toward Carrington. "Counselor." Carrington didn't answer immediately. He stood frozen for a second, flipping through pages in his binder like the truth had fallen between them. Finally, he cleared his throat. We have no objection, Your Honor." That pause, just those few seconds, were longer than anything Jalen had said. Long enough for the jury to notice. Long enough for the courtroom to feel it. Because no prosecutor hesitates when he knows he's right. Jalen took a quiet breath, the kind that said he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. He stepped closer. "You claimed Officer Ruiz saw me during the pursuit. But according to the arrest record, he wasn't the first on the scene. He didn't even join until after backup was called." Carrington tried to regain footing. Even if he wasn't first, he arrived at the scene. He made the arrest. "No," Jalen said. "He didn't. Officer Blake made the arrest. Ruiz only wrote the supplemental report, and that report said he saw me in the vehicle." He faced the jury again. "You ever play telephone? One person whispers to the next, and by the end, the story isn't even the same." He held up the report. "This right here is the broken version of that story, but this isn't a game. This isn't harmless." His voice dropped lower, firmer. "This is how innocent people end up behind bars. Someone adds their voice to a lie, and the lie becomes fact." He stepped back toward the defense table, keeping his eyes forward. "If we let that report stand without proof, without challenge, without even verifying where the officer was, then we're saying the badge is above the truth." Judge Grayson sat quietly, chin resting on his hand, no longer looking at Jalen like a defendant, but like a mirror held up to a system he'd stopped questioning long ago. Carrington no longer had the confidence of a man controlling the room. He looked small now, shrinking behind the formality of his suit. Jalen's words cut through once more. "If the logs confirm Ruiz wasn't there, what else in this case has been accepted without being examined?" He turned to Grayson. "That's the question we all should be asking." And for the first time in the trial, no one had an answer. Judge stunned by Teen's defense, courtroom silenced by truth. The room had grown still, like everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Outside, the sounds of a regular city day went on, horns, sirens, footsteps. But inside the courtroom, time moved slower. Even the air felt thicker. Judge Grayson sat hunched slightly forward, fingers pressed together in front of his mouth. He hadn't spoken in minutes. He was no longer drumming his desk, no longer smirking. He was listening. Jalen stood tall, arms loose at his side, as if he had nothing left to prove, because he didn't. He had already done what no one in the courtroom expected. He'd made them question what they thought they knew. Carrington looked rattled. His tie was slightly crooked now, the sweat beginning to bead along his temples. His opening confidence had melted into silence. His folder of arguments lay untouched on the table because what could he possibly flip to now? Grayson finally cleared his throat. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington stood slowly, like a man walking uphill. "No, Your Honor." His voice barely filled the room. The judge looked at him for a long time, then turned his gaze back to Jalen. Jalen didn't flinch. He simply waited, patient as stone. Grayson glanced toward the jury, then back at the file in front of him. He opened it, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was seeing. And what he saw now wasn't a car theft case. It was something deeper. He closed the file and spoke. "This court finds there is insufficient evidence to proceed with this case." He paused, the room froze. "Case dismissed." The words echoed like a dropped bell. For a moment no one moved. Then it began, gasps, whispers, chairs creaking as people shifted. Someone in the gallery exhaled loudly, like they'd been holding their breath the entire trial. Jalen didn't move. He stood still, absorbing the moment, not with arrogance, but with quiet, steady dignity. It wasn't just a victory. It was a vindication of something much bigger than himself. Judge Grayson looked at him again. There was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not judgment, not suspicion, something closer to reflection, maybe even regret. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then finally said, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen turned. "You should consider law school." Jalen didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything. He had already considered it. He had already chosen. Black teen walks free. Judge watches what he tried to ignore. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, spilling sunlight into a space that had felt so dark just moments before. Jalen stepped out slowly, the light hitting his face like he hadn't seen it in days, though he'd never been behind bars. The crowd outside was waiting, not because they knew the full truth, but because they'd smelled something different in the air. Reporters surged forward, microphones pointed like weapons. Flashbulbs burst around him. Their questions flew fast, sharp, chaotic. "Jalen, how did you do it? Did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What do you say to the system now?" Jalen didn't respond. He kept walking, one foot steady in front of the other. The trial was over, but his dignity, his calm that couldn't be caught in a headline. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother stood still in the crowd, arms crossed tight against her chest. Denise Dawson, a woman who had known too many courtrooms, seen too many tears. But this time her son wasn't the one crushed beneath the gavel. He had stood tall, taller than the lies, taller than the courtroom itself. She stared at him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then finally her arms unfolded. "You scared me half to death," she said. Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stepped forward and pulled him into her chest. Not with softness, but with the force of someone who'd held back everything just to stay strong. He let himself be held, just for a second. "You always were the stubborn one," she whispered. Cameras flashed behind them, but Jalen didn't care. The real moment wasn't for the crowd, it was for her. Across the street, away from the chaos, Judge Grayson stood alone near his car, watching. He didn't leave immediately. His hands were in his pockets now. His posture wasn't straight with pride, it slumped with the weight of realization. He hadn't expected this case to shake him. It was supposed to be routine. Just another kid, another charge, another file signed and sealed. But now he stood frozen in place, watching a boy he had once mocked walk away freer than he had ever been. For the first time, he saw what had been there all along. Not a defendant, but a voice, a mirror, a challenge, and for once the system blinked first. Inside that courtroom, Jalen had exposed more than a faulty report. He had cracked something older, deeper. A bias dressed in robes. A silence that had lasted too long. And though his footsteps echoed down the courthouse steps that day, they weren't the sound of someone escaping. They were the sound of someone arriving, not just at freedom, but at purpose. Sometimes the loudest revolution isn't a protest. It's a young black boy standing in silence in a room designed to silence him, and making truth speak louder than power. Jalen's story reminds us that justice should never depend on how you look, where you're from, or the color of your skin. It reminds us that the system may be flawed, but with courage, knowledge, and unwavering self-belief, even the most overlooked among us can make it blink. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins. If this story touched you, made you think, or opened your heart even just a little, leave a comment and tell us what stayed with you most. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Black Unbreakable so you won't miss the stories we're telling next, because this is just the beginning. In the videos to come, we'll keep shining a light on the struggles, the triumphs, and the unseen brilliance of Black lives that history tried to erase. Stories of heartbreak, stories of glory, stories that will move you, and stories you've never heard before. And each one will remind you we are still here, still rising, still unbreakable.